right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, this entire week on this awesome event. And thank you to all of our sponsors that make this whole thing possible, this event. So thanks, everybody. Well, Active Directory. I'm seeing that slogan about Active Directory being dead and of no interest is very obviously true. Yeah. Okay, I'm Fred, known for my beard and my questionable sense of humor. I hope you've got your resistance spiked up. I'm a customer engineer working for Microsoft in dealing with infrastructure and security topics and automation, lots of automation. And well, one of my customers had a slight problem. They did this thing called manual labor, and they did have more than 300 Active Directory forests to keep somehow running. So a simple schema update could take up to 2 years, and there was no way at all for anybody to tell how far along we are with deploying whatever state. Because especially since there were so many ongoing changes that everybody would be confused about what particular change are you talking about. So anything relying on the identity infrastructure would have some trouble going forward, slightly, a little bit. So we needed to solve this whole thing. And this was an awesome learning opportunity for me and for them. For me, about scaling, building something large, something huge, something scaling. When we build PowerShell, in many cases, we're basically building a tool to support a process. Now we were building a solution that the entire process would be wrapped around. So I'm starting with, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve fundamentally, not just the detailed manual labor thing, but in general? And how do we go about redesigning this whole thing, the entire idea behind this? Which is why you're seeing me, let's open the shell and do it nerd, doing PowerPoint slides. Thank you for being with me. Now, the first thing with a project we really needed to do is like the scope. What do we want to use this tool for? What do we want to support with that? And first of all, we want to deploy and manage the entire topology. From schema extensions down to individual delegations, we want it all. And we want it in a new domain, we want it in an existing domain, and something somebody probably should have cleaned and removed and migrated the user base over about a dozen years ago. Yeah. We want this available as a continual process, as something that on a permanent basis makes our life easier. We want to be able to manage an entire project with that and simplify our documentation, analyze for best practices. There's a start there. That means we first have to define what are our best practices, but we want to be able to tell whether somebody adheres to what we consider a good practice. Since, quite frankly, that customer, they didn't have total autonomy over every single environment. They were in an advisory position as well. And do they adhere to their advice? Well, we want the same tool to handle all of that. Compromise recovery situations, security policy management, just analyzing what kind of delegations are out there and documenting everything. The documentation part is a large part of the whole thing, and we want this whole thing to support logging. Every single change, everything we do, there needs to be some trace there. And this is built on PowerShell framework or PS framework. If you've never heard of that, it's extensible logging. Whatever your logging needs is, it is covered. And either on a single domain or forest, it needs to be viable small scale in a lab environment. It needs to be scaled, obviously scaled into the hundreds. We want to be able to run it on a local server, on a domain controller, or on some bastion forest or the machine completely non-domain joined, just with the credentials and the domain name, and get going. What we definitely and explicitly do not cover, if you're trying to make this solution work for you, and it's all MIT on GitHub, free to use for everybody and documented, but if you're trying to do daily operations with this, you're not going to have fun. And we do not actually audit for change. So if, for example, if you've got a domain admins group and you want to monitor any changes to that, this tool will detect that the domain admins group is not in the correct state. There's somebody in there that shouldn't be in there. It's not going to tell you who did that change. For that, you still need to audit your domain controllers. So, classic problem. Let's take a look at a changelog of Active Directory for the server 2022. Yeah. What we rarely comment upon is that the same is true for the change in administrative practices that we're doing this so far. Hasn't been substantially changed since, I don't know, PowerShell? I think PowerShell was the latest update to that. So when we try to do an Active Directory project, what happens? We set an architect, we've got a problem that we're trying to solve. He looks at the production environment, and then he sets up a plan, the plan. That plan is like documentation, we want to go there, and now we need to find a way to go there, and either we do manual labor, or we develop some automation to do that. In order for this whole thing to work then, we need a test environment to see whether we actually do break everything, or whether it keeps working. Yes, yes. There's one annoyance for me with that particular one, and that is a significant time delta between we have the plan and we are ready to execute and it's everything done. And then we hit the most legendary problem every single person in the room has hit. Because incidentally, even if you're trying our best to maintain this thing, is due to the time change, somebody with absolute guarantee changed something in the meantime. But even if they don't, and it's honestly, the only way a test environment and a production environment are the same is if they are actually the same environment and you're testing in production. Not that that would stop everybody. Okay, and then there's the next problem. Well, who says there's only one production environment? And then that's where those of us who work in consulting usually come in, because once that project actually somehow managed to muddle to success, time changes. Time moves on. And in 2 years, in 3 years, the entire documentation that we have of our ID environment is that plan somebody wrote 3.5 years ago. Maybe somebody updated it partially, maybe not, but generally what we now need to do if we want to figure out what's happening, what is actually our environment like and what it's supposed to look like, we need to look at the plan, we need to look at the change in requirements, extrapolate what the plan should look like, and then compare to what actually occurs. So, yeah, thank you. This whole thing has another dimension from a development perspective, and we're all more or less PowerShell developer, at least in the room, and that is we do a lot of custom scripting in order to even make this whole thing work. That means we need to spend cash to make it happen because developer time is expensive. There's a time delay between we have a requirement and we make it happen, and that might mean by the time we are done writing our code, the requirements are no longer the same. And then somebody has to go ahead and document all that code, and we all know how much we love documenting our code. Funny consequences that come along with the quality of the whole thing is, for example, we tend to have the wrong person writing the automation, which hopefully is an AD specialist, but if the number of people that are hardcore specialists in Active Directory and in PowerShell is a fairly small number of person. Now, I would generally prefer an AD specialist to be the person writing the code in that case. But still, as part of our development, we realized that somebody would accidentally give the client admins full control over every single group policy in the domains with the previous approach. So things can go wrong, and this is not really the place where we want coding practices to hit the problem. Then there's the redundancy. We can only reinvent creating organizational units so often, and be unique about that. If we have multiple projects going on or multiple coded solutions, they kind of might affect the same thing and might not like affecting the same thing, which especially for consultants going somewhere else rather than having one environment, usually leads to slight problems, especially if you have that documentation problem and need to figure out how the whole thing collapses. Somebody has to maintain the whole code, and the whole project time can get extensive, which if you have a security incident is a very, very specific separate negative. So what do we do? Instead, what is the thing that we're showing off today? We've got an architect. We still need somebody that designs what our environment is supposed to look like. So take a look at production. We create a plan. However, this plan is not some Word document that somebody puts in a file share. It's a non-Word document. Lots of individual files. We'll be looking at the details that somebody puts in the source control, ideally, which is where the session title comes from. This document is being fed to the Active Directory Management Framework and understood. And with that, we now go to the test environment and we check whether the test environment is actually the same and configured the same way that we put into that document. And if that's so, great. Otherwise, we generate a very specific list of changes that you would now perform. Now we can iterate on the document to make those adjustments. And once we're happy with them, we can tell it, go ahead and do it. Now, if anybody in the room kind of is thinking now, wait a sec, is Fred just now describing desired state configuration? You would not be wrong. Only we're not using it. Desired state configuration is an awesome tool. It has, however, one limitation. It is very, very difficult to actually only apply a selected list of changes. The thing is, this tool is designed that you go to production with that, and you can't just apply every single thing over that, especially if you have to somehow manage those lists against 100 of forests. You need to be able to select it, and that's why desired state configuration is not the tool that we decided to use. However, the concepts are similar. We desire what is it supposed to look like in a way we can put into source control, a normal human can read. We'll be seeing that in the demo. And once we have our changes correct, we go to the production environment, to the first one, or whatever production environment we want to look at. And then we do the test and see the changes. And if there has been a drift, if something is not equal to the test environment, we can now detect that and plan for that. Maybe update the desired state, maybe and do again the apply cycle to the test environment. But the time delta between having brought the test environment into desired state and to getting an exact list of what's wrong in this forest could be something like 5 minutes. At least we can now go ahead and iterate swiftly and unify these environments so that our test environment actually kind of reflects what would happen. And once we're happy with all of that, we can apply it. Again, we can cherry pick whatever we want to apply. We don't have to apply the entire list of changes. We cannot have this bring them into compliance phase over several years if we have to, just step by step by step, because often enough there are external dependencies. And we can just do the same thing to any amount of environments. And once we have them in compliance, we can iterate from the plan back to production, get the next list based on the next requirements, update the plan. And since it's in source control, we now have a changelog of who changed the desired state. We have a full history of what was our desired state, what did we want from our environment, and the time to find out what is the delta and what should go into a changelog for the next changed event. No, it requires very, very little manual labor and very little time. The actual time for an individual test run, of course, depends on the scale of the environment. When you have a huge environment, it can take, I think the longest we had for a scan was 15 minutes for a full scan of every single component. Which leads us to the architectural aspects. How the hell do we define them? How the hell go the bits together that we can actually build a configuration we can apply to 300 forests, which have very different requirements, actually. That might be in different geographical location or plural locations, that might have a completely different security policy requirements. So the whole thing hinges on the concept we call context. A context is a set of configurations and metadata, and we can combine them. For example, I can have one default context for all my baselines, like what I expect of my environment, but I can have different IPsec group policies depending on which environment we're deploying to. Or whether we have some special Hyper-V virtualization, some special forest types going on that is only maybe available in one environment or in the other. We can have dependencies, so you can't select production without the default. And you can also have mutual exclusion, so you can't select production and dev environment at the same time. We could have special cases for credential management. We have the ability to integrate the credential management for break glass accounts. or differentiate between root domains and child domains. And in that context, we put everything in there, from a group policy object, users, schema extensions, schema default permissions, site topology, groups, access rules, individual ones, organizational units, individual links, and a huge list of items more. As mentioned, we have dependency, exclusion, and load order, and some other metadata to make this whole thing happen. And when we then combine them, when we select, I want to test this domain, I select which of these contexts that I have provided I want to apply to that. I can make that automatic. I can, there's a UI if you don't have this pre-configured. There's a UI that lets you pick with checkboxes. You'll be seeing that one. And once we do combine multiple contexts, it will take the settings that we have defined in any given context and add to an entire set. And in case we have some overlap, some group policy, some context is affecting the same setting, well, the last one applied wins. But since we did document all of our changes in structured data that we can analyze, we can now, with very limited effort, check whether we have two configurations that actually conflict. So, yeah, what we end up turning is all of these custom codes that we would write into configuration entries. It's JSON, and soon we're supporting PSD1. That's going to happen in the next major release of the toolkit. That you can find that in whichever of the two works best for you. And then we set up an entire folder structure with the whole thing. Again, you're not required to build this folder structure. Just a tool that basically new context, and you can then fill in the thing. There's everything documented and how is it supposed to look like. I so hate PowerPoint. Which is why we're now ready to roll and look into the live demo environment. Now, I hope the demo gods are kind to me, which of course means they won't be, but, well, that's the game. By the way, in case you're wondering on that, how the hell do I get my lab environments? There's a great project out there, Automated Lab, so I don't actually have to put in much effort about those. So this little lab is, I don't know, maybe 10 lines of code. These two domains, admin host and certificate authority. So if you ever need a lab environment, I strongly recommend looking at automatedlab.org. All right. Now, please tell me I did not. Okay. Yes, Fred, you of course forget that one day. And now we actually do have an empty field. We've got nothing. So far, we do have an Active Directory that already exists. It has a few content items. Somebody just, put our tiering sys configuration together, and let's hope he did a good job. I mean, that's what we usually work with. Let's hope they did a good job so far. So, you stop messing around. Good enough. And PowerShell. New ADMF context. And the only thing I really need to give it here is a name. And if I hit the spacebar, that actually works. Let's go with Contoso default. Okay, let's see. Works. And grab that. Actually, I now sound a lot more audible. Let's improve the console size to something people actually can read. And there we go. We now have a context. and it involves some scripts at the beginning, but mostly we don't have to deal with that whole thing. We can now pick any given item that we want to define and take a look at that. So we're good to go. So we've got nothing defined, so let's see what happens when we do a test. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? I didn't really say that, no, did I? Okay, I'm going to scan contoso.com, and since I actually don't want to have us waiting at that time to do the schema default permission scan, because for access right check we will have to build what is supposed to be on the object by default in order to be able to figure out the delta. That takes some time. I'm going to restrict our options to just organizational units, because that is something we can very easily put together, and the test is going to be over fairly fast, I hope. Oh, for the current domain, we have not yet selected any context. And since we didn't have select anything, I mean, imagine you run the invoke against the domain and haven't figured any configuration, and it says, oh, wait a sec, let me clean up a little bit because there's more in there than there's supposed to be. That would be kind of bad. So strong advice, first go with test before you go with invoke, and yeah, avoid selecting the wrong configuration. And what did it do? It, well, refused to do anything that we haven't any configuration for. So even though we could theoretically now decide every organizational unit is undesirable, but since you're supposed to still be comfortably be able to run to just test for everything, and we don't want it to fail on those two items where you just decided to not yet go and implement it. Okay, let's skip if we don't have at least one item in there. So, make that a little bit more readable. In all of these folders, you should be seeing some README file describing items. And everybody of us loves to read README files. We all do that, and there's no way we would want some, online help that can figure us out how to do it in a more comfortable and searchable way. So we do actually have a website called admf.1, where we have not actually 100% coverage, but close enough to it that I'm comfortable to brag about it. And on the documentation side, there's a getting started guidance on how to set up your configuration. So when you now want to delve deeper, there's everything in there. We also have a bit more video details on some of the aspects. But most notably, there is a component reference where you can get guidance on every single item, how it's supposed to look like. And going into organizational units, what you want is a name, a description, and a path. So let's just take that one, create a new JSON. The file name it doesn't matter. You can have as many files as you feel comfortable with. So putting everything into one file is okay. Having one file per setting is no worse. So let's create one for a tier 0 environment. And the lead organizational unit for that is here, the tier 0 item. So let's just take that one. And let's test that again. Not all that great. The thing is, in order to facilitate mass processing, we don't automatically load the configuration every single time. So the first time we load it, and then we're done, obviously, and we don't need to redo that again. Because if you have hundreds of configuration files, you don't want to reload them every single time for 200 domains. So the easiest way is either to make sure you restart the console, or you just tell it to re-import it by force. That is the most certain way to ensure that everything is done. And we can now test again, get the context prompt again, since it only stores that in the module scope, and then since we re-imported it, it forgot what is the configuration supposed to be. And we get our first change item. It detects that we have an organizational unit that has already the correct name, but the description is wrong. Now, for most test results, they look the same, mostly the same all the time. There's a difference in what is in the change property, since there's an iterative growth over how we realized that better information would be better and how that should be looking like. So the changed property actually in this case only has a description. For access rules, you would instead see, I am going to remove the full control permissions for the following identity, and that's it. What we always have is we have a configuration option property. This is what we said should be desired state. And we always have the AD object, which is what is the actual reality. There's only two exceptions to that. If you have a creation result, obviously we don't have an AD object yet. If you have a removal result, usually that is because we found an object we actually don't have an existence configured for. Which now leads to the next problem, actually. You see, we have a lot of organizational units in that domain, and we only configured one, but it didn't tell us the other ones are undesired. So what exactly do we want to look at? In a highly volatile domain with lots of users coming and going, we don't actually want to enforce our policies for the entire forest. We actually only care about the security relevant parts, maybe the servers, but I don't want to have to define every single user object in configuration with all the properties it's supposed to have. That's not going to be a winning game. So this whole thing hinges on one item that we first need to do, and it's probably also going to be the last one that we do. And that is in the domain folder itself, we need to define something called domain content mode, which is where we define what is the scope of what we want our domain to be. What part of the domain do we want to look at? And for that, we need a JSON file with a very specific name and a very specific layout. It's called content-mode.json in the domain folder itself. I can either tell it I want to control everything except for that which I exclude, or I could tell it I actually only want to include a very specific folder and anything outside of that that I explicitly define. So just because for example, I set the content mode to only include tier 1 doesn't mean I can't define tier 0 objects. It's just that if somewhere in the tier 0 structure somebody adds something I didn't account for, we are going to ignore it. So let's go about that, adding this one and moving that over to the include, because I really don't want to have to manage that for define everything here right now. With that updated, and again, import that again, test. In case you're wondering how I get my previous inputs, that's the key binding Control-R, search in your input history, available on every default console. You don't need to have my modifications of that. And there we go. We now have one subfolder, sub-OU groups, and it's now intent on removing that because we only have that in here. Nothing to go with that, so we're not in the desired state. Let's go ahead and do it. Did it. And with the test, oh, it shouldn't have done that. Oh, right. This is the next problem. Besides the usual demo effects here, when we do invoke a full execution of everything, we first create organizational units, but we don't do the deletion step at the same time. because the old organizational units might have groups and users that we want to first move because we have a definition for them. We know we want them in the new structure. So we don't want an arrow because can't delete OU, there's still content. So we first create a new structure, then we move items over, and then we can kill the old structure. So we have a separate OU step for that. Soft and hard. Hard is the kill action. So it, didn't do the kill because on the invoke I only told it to go easy on it. That's better. Our change is done. Everything is completed. We look into the AD and, oh, the groups object is no longer existing. It's gone. And if you now look into the structure, and do a refresh, explicit refresh, we should have a description on that. Probably in the there it is. So, it works in controso.com. Last item before we go to the questions part. Let's see how Fabricam is looking like. Again, I just switched to the domain, so it instantaneously know, oh, we don't have a context selected for that. So please select what actually applies to this domain. There we go. We don't have a tier 0 OU yet because it's basically a virgin environment with nothing in there yet. So yeah, let's fix that. Oh, damn it. Yeah, I might need more privileges there. I don't have a credential provider registered for that. I can have automatic credential management workflows integrate into my KeyPass or whatever password solution I want, and then update comments that I checked out that password, reset the password after the fact. That's up to what you want to extend here. But I can just tell it use fabricam/administrator, which is totally not the default lab password here. And now the test should be happy. All right, that's it. The rest is mostly going, building the configuration. We do have 1.8 on that, and for many of the options, we do have scanning examples. How can I generate that data from an existing environment so I don't have to handcraft every bloody setting? Because let's be honest, it's manual labor, and kind of have some religious prohibitions against manual labor when I can avoid it, so yeah. All right, questions?
So you logged into the domain controller on that? Does it only run on the domain?
No, actually I'm not on the domain controller, I'm on the admin host. And I just went through an entirely different forest. Actually, there's a trust configured because, quite honestly, in the lab definition, it would have been more effort to make it not establish that trust. I don't need even a trust. As long as I have legal credentials and I do have the Active Directory tools on hand. What we do need for some of the aspects, we need to be able to use ADWS, Active Directory Web Service, the default Active Directory commands, which must be available on the executing machine. For some operations, we do straight LDAP. And for some operations, we need PowerShell remoting to a domain controller in the target environment, which is mostly because we need to do some resolution from STDL strings, which resolves to the local domain you're resolving them on in some cases for things like domain admin. So in order to be able to reliably resolve permissions, for some information, we had to run it on the target domain. Also for group policies. So those are the permissions we need, but no, we don't need to run this on a domain controller. Yes?
How do you, when this is deployed to the customer, how do you handle kind of the security of this unauthorized changes to the configuration?
For that, you should have a secure admin workstation, something like a privileged access workstation, or your own implementation of hardening for that. Because, of course, in order to run this, you need tier 0 permissions. You need domain admin for this. And yeah, if you use those credentials on a non-secure machine, that's a problem. The same is, of course, for the configuration data, because if somebody that is not the same level of privilege can modify those, that would be a problem. So what we have with the main customer I implemented that with, Azure DevOps Server, that is only for the tier 0 administration. We had certain tier 1 admins guest rights to connect to that and submit pull requests. So the network team for them is allowed to submit updates to the network configuration, like the site topology, if they have a reason to do so. But that's still then subject to pull request and review. They can't make direct changes to whatever is deployed to production. Yes?
So you mentioned this like desired state configuration, which auto runs obviously. Is there a policy for auto running?
Do we have any auto running capabilities for this? No, we don't provide anything like that. There is, however, nothing that prevents you from setting up a scheduled task with the necessary permissions. There is no enforcement of interactivity. That user prompt, for example, that you saw for the context selection, that happens because we did not select anything. You can totally pre-configure which domain gets which context. And then that whole detection doesn't work. Yes?
You mentioned before that this is not for user or computer configuration. So I assume it's not for the groups the user is part of and so on. But when you,
To answer that, not intended for user and computer management. It's not intended for everyday users that the regular users out there. For tier 0 admin accounts, it is very much intended. For as far as group membership is concerned, we support dynamic group membership based on, for example, which organizational unit you are in. So there is some way we can make sure that happens, but you would have a lot of changes if you applied that to user objects that are fluid and organizational units that have lots of traffic. Yes?
For the user changes, some kinds of, for example, don't expire or something like that, some kind of properties for the user. There could be
we can define this for user objects that we manage, yes. We do not yet have an implementation for every, to do like compliance rules for non-managed objects. It would be something I consider probably worth doing, especially when we can do it in a generic manner. So we don't hard code this like for password never expires on user objects, but instead you can define for objects in AD that meet the following requirement, the following attribute should comply to the following rule. This would actually be an excellent issue to raise. If you don't mind doing that, I'll definitely look into that we make that happen. Anything else? Anything you want to see?
One thing, all the configuration that you get from this, you manually predefine it. Is there a way that you can export current configuration?
There is, okay. Can we somehow export like an existing Active Directory into configuration? The answer to that is yein. Yes and no. For some aspect that works really, really well, and where we can do so, we have provided snippets as what you see on screen right now on how you can generate that configuration from an existing environment. We have discussed adding an export command that does that for everything we can define. But for example, from the question before, some dynamic rules about what's supposed to be and what's not supposed to be, that gets a lot harder. What we do have currently explicitly when we're exporting from an existing environment is the only option actually, is group policy objects. We do have a roadmap item that you don't need to do the backup and restore route for group policy objects. We do have plans for being able to define individual settings, but we're not there yet. So in that case, exporting is actually the only option. What we do also have, which I did not show before because there is a latest annoyance in that first when it comes to demonstrating that. When we go with ADMF, new ADMF context, there are a few parameters. Specifically, we do have the default access rules a cleanly set up domain should be having. Because having to manually handcraft every single access rule is painful. So yeah, that's something we have configuration for. What we'll also soon be adding as a parameter, we already have that calculated, is for Exchange integration, both in the default mode and split permissions. So we have those rules already. You can find them in the documentation on the website, but we do not have a parameter to automatically inject that yet in that command. But it's coming. So now we have here a new context, default permissions, and in domain access rules. You can find a lot of details on what is, for example, supposed to happen on a domain controller. We also have additional items. You can, for example, reference the parent in an access rule, because every virtual host on a or at least in certain situations, a virtual machine, like a virtual domain controller, will have a service connection point under it where the object has direct permissions. So you can assign permissions like that. So anyway, before I dive too much into the details on that, yes, we do have some templates for the default stuff. We will be improving on that. So if you have any complaints, please file an issue on GitHub, which you can find on the website. There's a button for GitHub. Yes, we do have on the GitHub repository for the website, the documentation itself, a short example configuration and a setup guidance on setting up a test environment to play around with that. We are definitely looking to expand on the examples because, yeah, the devil is in the detail and there are lots and lots of little tiny cogs to manipulate. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes? Ah, sorry. Well, if not, we've got 3 minutes left over. Let's call it at that. You know where to find me on the conference floor. People who already know me will know it is never a problem to get me to brag about my toys. So speak up if you have any particular questions, if you want something demoed, if you want to look how I made my prompt in the console, whatever. So as long as it's PowerShell, I'm very certain I can safely say my reaction will be most positive. All right. Thank you, everybody. And